Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a recent book published just last month entitled Crucibles of Power, Smolensk under Stalinist and Nazi Rule by Georgetown University historian Michael David Fox, with discussants Nicole Eaton and Stephen Kotkin. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar, along with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. As some of you may know, the seminar, launched in 2010, has been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. Before March of 2020, we gathered in person in the Wilson Center building in Washington, D.C., and since the summer of that year, we've been gathering here online, assembling participants from across the country and indeed the globe. A couple of things before we get started. First, as always, we like to recognize that key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors makes these seminars possible week after week, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, we ask you to take note of our next session of the seminar, which will be in 1 week's time on March 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We reconvene to discuss Samuel J. Hearst's Against the Liberal Order, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and Statist Internationalism, 1919 to 1939. Third point, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of past programs are archived. Fourth, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function. That means we call on you, you unmute, you get to pose the question yourself, or you can use the Q&A function on Zoom, in which case my colleague Christian Osterman will pose the question for you. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, I turn this over to Christian, who will introduce our speaker and then our discussants and moderate the discussion. Christian, all yours.
Thank you, Eric. Delighted to moderate this wonderful panel. Let me say up front that a word of thanks to our colleagues at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center who are co-sponsoring this event. And with that, let me introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Michael David Fox. He's professor and director of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and director of the center. He's director of that center at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. A historian of Russia and the USSR, his work has ranged across political and cultural history, communism, fascism, the history of the Russian Revolution, and comparative revolutionary studies, transnational studies, and modernity theory, and the history of Bolshevism and Stalinism. His most recent research explores the history of the Eastern Front of World War II, Nazi-Stalinist entanglements, political violence, the German occupation of Russian territories in World War II, and the historical roots and history politics of Putinism. He's the author of Revolution of the Mind, Higher Learning Among Bolsheviks, 1918 to 1929, showcasing the Great Experiment, Cultural Diplomacy, and Western Visitors to the Soviet Union, 1921 to 1941, Crossing Borders, Modernity, Ideology, and Culture in Russia and the Soviet Union, winner of the 2016 Historia Nova Prize for Best Book in Russian Intellectual and Cultural History, and of course, Crucibles of Power, Smolensk under Stalinist and Nazi Rule, published just a couple of weeks ago. He researched this book while at the Wilson Center as a fellow, so welcome back, Michael. Wonderful to have you here, and the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Christian, for that. Yes, the Wilson Center got my start on this book longer ago than I care to remember, but 2014 to be exact. But thank you, Eric. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to start by showing you some maps. So I'm going to share my screen here. And what you see in the darkest part of this map is essentially a Smolensk Oblast or region as it exists today. and basically as it existed from 1944 after the re-Sovietization on the Eastern Front until in 1944 until through 1991. The slightly less dark areas here were part of this small Smolensk region in the period that I studied it before 1929 and after 1937. But what this map essentially shows is this giant western region, also with its capital in Smolensk, that existed between 1929 and 1937. That giant western region, had a population of over 6 million. The smaller region I studied, the two darkest areas, had only 2.3 million population. And so I actually worked with a really great historical cartographer. And amazingly, she found that virtually the only decent extant map of this giant western region, which existed only between 1929 and 37, under the old Bolshevik Rumyantsev, who Merle Feinsod once called the quintessential little Stalin. That was the Feinsod's 1958 book, had virtually the only map in the world today of the Western region. And that book, Smolensk Under Soviet Rule, was foundational to US Soviet studies, and the homage to that book is in the subtitle of my own. My prologue, The Captured Archive, revisits the seizure of the Regional Communist Party archive in Smolensk, which was captured by the Germans in 1941 and transported west. The portion which fell into American hands after the war was the only Communist Party documentation available in the West during the Cold War. But it was that's the so-called Smolensk Archive. But it was fragmentary. It was only about 1 to 2% of the material that I was able to at least had available to access in the 2010s in both Smolensk and Moscow. And the captured archive petered out right in 1937. But even so, I would say that those files from Smolensk, the Smolensk archive, became very deeply embedded in the field of Soviet studies during its formative decades, in part because of Feinsod's foundational work. So my own work on this book, in part, also became a journey through the history of the field. And space and borders and territorial administration, which are exemplified on this rather complicated map, was part of the main topic of the book, power and power relations. It was no coincidence, as Stalin might have said, that the region's two largest administrative reorganizations in 1929 and 1937 coincided exactly with the launching of Stalin's Great Break, the Stalin Revolution of the late 20s, and the Great Terror. More than that, Smolensk was far from Moscow in the sense that it was a very rural region, but it was relatively close, as you know, to Moscow geographically. And in key ways, it served both in the Smolensk affair of the late 20s, which was a massive purge and signal to all rural regions across the Soviet Union, purge of the party and state apparatus. It served as a kind of precedent and all-union example. And I'd say one can make the case that the same thing was a kind of certain things happened there first in the Great Terror as well. What my book does is try to discard the simple dichotomy of center-periphery relations. What I try to show is that the scrambling of levels of power, central power, regional, and then district and local level power. The scrambling of those levels, and specifically using the power of the center to direct and mobilize local forces against entrenched district and regional levels was central both to the Stalin Revolution and to the Great Terror. Levels of power also really important for the fateful feedback loop between Berlin and the occupied territories on the Eastern Front, which was central to the German occupation in World War II, and after 1941, the escalation of the so-called Holocaust by bullets, which was led into the genocide of the Jews. The German invasion route you can see on this map with the arrow, pointing to Smolensk and then towards Moscow. This lay directly on the Minsk-Moscow highway, the Magistral, as it was called, that was built by Gulag forced labor, a traveling Gulag camp, as it were, in 1936. And the yellow marks the smaller Smolensk region that I wrote about. Army Group Center had about over 40% of all German divisions. It had over half the tanks, and it had a huge concentration of Wehrmacht and SS forces. And that was, of course, due to the fact that Smolensk lay directly on the road to Moscow. And without massive help by armed and unarmed collaborators including in this primarily ethnically Russian region, the German occupation regime simply would have not been capable of prosecuting the war at the front and holding its massive territories, which at their height included about over 68 million people, over 40% of the pre-war Soviet population. So to sum up what I was trying to do in this book, my book is an attempt to write a new kind of entangled history. Instead of just studying Stalinism alone or the German occupation of Soviet territory on the Eastern Front and World War II alone, or looking at the Holocaust, I looked for where all those three areas and three fields, which are not as interconnected as they might be, I looked at where they intersected and what insights I could get by examining them together. And each chapter juxtaposes Russian language and German language material and the German Nazi and the Russian Soviet sides, as it were. So unlike, for example, let's say Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, which was, of course, a very sweeping synthesis, my book aims at the grassroots, but also at the place where the local and regional history meet the grand narrative. And I should say that, Stalin and Hitler are constant presences in this book, but although they never knew the 10 to 12 main characters whose experiences and choices and decision-making I trace throughout the chapters. I'm only going to be able to talk about briefly two of those main characters of the book. The first is the wartime mayor of Smolensk, sitting at the desk there, Boris Menshagin. And in my view, analyzing regimes or systems alone limits our understanding of Stalinism and Nazism, because that can't capture power dynamics as manifested in people's lives, in the lives of local and regional actors. Power also means power relations among people. And it's those locals in particular who saw in cataclysm an opportunity to advance, to seize a slice of power, I think are a special focus of what was trying to look at. And I think that initiative, as it were, by locals using power was not only enabled by both revolutionary regimes of left and right, but in fact required by them. Before he became mayor of Smolensk after 41, Menshagin served as a defense attorney in Smolensk in the 1930s, where he became locally famous for saving several defendants in the regional show trials during the Great Terror. Menshagin's activities under Stalinism actually bear an uncanny parallel to his behavior in the between the German occupation and Stalinism. Those activities bear an uncanny parallel. Menshagin was a technocrat. He was not an ideologue. In all matters, great and small, he subordinated himself first to the Soviet system, then to the German military authorities. But he did use the power that he had to save some victims of both regimes, maintaining that he was more ethical, more cultured than all the venal opportunists who surrounded him. And he did that parallel between what he did under Stalinism and the German occupation illustrates what I call in the book biographical logics. And of course, human decision-making is studied in so many disciplines, from neuroscience to economics. And what I was trying to do, and I was trying to make the case that what historians can do is to grasp the trajectories of lives, right? Because we know how people's lives played out as historians, and fix their decisive turning points, which in turn can be deeply contextualized to illuminate people's self-presentations, the sources that we have about those lives. And another thing I was trying to do was to show that past choices bias future decisions. For so many figures in my book, the experience of Stalinism conditioned their choices that they made when the Germans arrived. And ultimately, Menshagin, for example, justified, even to himself, likely, serving Berlin in the same moralistic terms that he justified serving Moscow. Under both regimes, he held a position of local prominence that also required technical skills that he possessed. And in both cases, he sometimes saved victims, but also acquired for himself status and authority, that is to say, power, especially in the war over the Russian civilian population, where he wielded the power of life and death. This book, which I helped join the editorial team when it was published in 2019, is actually twice as long as the one I just published, 823 pages. Menshagin's incredibly detailed and revealing wartime recollections had never been published, nor had anything similar been seen from a Russian mayor under German occupation. Let me just move on to the second person who you see circled here on the lower left. This is the one photograph that I was able to find of a remarkable young woman, Lyudmila Madzyuk, 21 years old in 1941. Everyone called her Lucia. And as this photo suggests, she was a quintessential member of the 1930s generation, the first Soviet cohort that had never experienced pre-revolutionary life. Right after, this was typical for that generation, at least the urban part, when the Germans invaded in June 41, she dropped her engineering courses. She went to the front. Encircled by the Germans, she teamed up, captured with another character in my book, a member of the Komsomolka, a young communist youth league, Asya Schneiderman, who remarkably hid her Jewish identity from the Germans. Both of them briefly ended up in a POW camp near Smolensk city. And when civilians and young women like her were released, she got papers to live in Smolensk. She formed the first communist underground group in occupied Smolensk. There, they smuggled food to the ghetto and to the POW camp or gulag. So compared to Menshagin, Lucia's choice after the invasion was the polar opposite. She risked her life for the Soviet cause. And she also left some of the most insightful autobiographical statements I found about occupied Smolensk and virtually a taboo topic, sexual violence and sexual relations between Russian women and German men, which is topic of an entire chapter. So what does Lucia's Madzyuk's case say about biographical logics? She hated the fact the Germans didn't believe, and she knew some German she was able to interact in the city of Smolensk during the war, that she could never become an aviation engineer. because their fascist version of the German gender order would not allow that. And Madzuk, after the war, successfully realized the career that she had always imagined as a professional woman, an applied chemist. But it happened far from Moscow, because apparently when her father was repressed, she made it to Ukhta, the Komi Republic, where she became head of the chemistry department in the local energy directorate. So in other words, just as pre-war experiences so deeply shaped wartime choices, the wartime experiences in turn shaped post-war trajectories. And Madzuk died in 2002 at the age of 81. So just to finish up here, I'd like to just, of the tapestry of themes in the book, I'd like to just highlight two in particular for this particular audience. The first is the partisan war, and the second is what I call synergies of violence. This map that you see here was created on the basis of an NKVD agent's hand-drawn report, and Smolensk and Bryansk nearby had the largest partisan movements. The fact that, however, that partisans came to power for almost 6 months behind enemy lines in 1942, and this is shown in these areas, in the dark areas, especially Yelnya and Dorogobuj, which I studied really in depth. But those darker regions, that's never really been explored on the basis of serious documentation. So in a nutshell, I found there was a huge range of partisan units, from, marauders to those completely off Moscow's radar. But at the same time, in their forest camps, many of these partisans created a distinct wartime subculture. It's kind of a freebooting, you know, realm with its own leaders who were often warlords, its own currency, which was food and moonshine. It had many of them had their own ruling class, which was drawn from the party state elites who were able to adapt themselves to the war. But when those territories restored Soviet power in 1942, they immediately set about recollectivizing agriculture and a rudimentary welfare state. And I call that phenomenon Stalinism without Stalin. I'm going to end the show here and just finish up with a few remarks about my last topic, which is violence. In Lucia's story, I mentioned the POW camp, or the Dulag, the Durchganglager, the holding camp for POWs. Yitzhak Arad, who's a historian of the Holocaust, estimated that the scale of the Holocaust in pre-1939 Soviet territory was between 2.063 and 2.169 million people. The destruction of the Soviet POWs in these POW camps was larger, up to 3.3 million people. It was a war crime, clearly, but it cannot be classified as a genocide in a legal or historical sense. And in fact, one of the purposes of the camps, as I try to show, I have some smoking guns in terms of the documents, but the starvation was a highly effective means to recruit, and not only to destroy these POWs, to recruit them as collaborators. So despite the fact that the same East European, Eastern Front context is the same place for all our post-war understandings and definitions of both genocide and crimes against humanity derives, there's never been a monograph in English about one of the most substantial crimes, the destruction of the Soviet POWs, and perhaps that explains it, that it can't be classified as a genocide in the terms that we own. There are only a few works in German and Russian on this, and I end up calling it a war crime of genocidal proportions. Extremely violent regimes never have only one victim group. And in that chapter, Synergies of Violence, I treat the destruction of the POWs, the Holocaust, the anti-partisan war, and other waves of German violence as very much interconnected, both in terms of the perpetrators and how they unfolded in slightly different timelines in the course of 41, 42, and the rest of the occupation. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the commentary, and I want to thank Nicole Eaton and Stephen Kotkin for taking part.
Thank you, Michael, for this very helpful overview. I'm really excited now to introduce Nicole Eaton, Associate Professor of History at Boston College, as our first commentator in this round. Her research interests include nationalism, communism, fascism, ethnic cleansing, borderlands, urban history, the Second World War, environmental history, and the history of medicine in East Central Europe and Eurasia. Her 2023 book, German Blood, Slavic Soil, How Nazi Königsberg Became Soviet Kaliningrad, was the winner of the 2024 ASEES Reginald Zelnick Prize for an outstanding monograph on the history of Eurasia, and received honorable mention for the Bruce Lincoln Prize for outstanding first monograph in Russian history, and for the German Studies Association and German Academic Exchange Service Book Prize. Was named one of the Foreign Affairs Best Books of 2023. We're delighted to be able to say that she was a Title VIII research scholar with the Kennan Institute here at the Wilson Center in 2014-15, when Michael was there as well, I guess. So welcome back, Nicole, to the Wilson Center. It's wonderful to have you in the Zoom room today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to speak on two levels about what I think makes this book, Crucibles of Power, impressive, relevant, and absolutely a must-read. And so those two levels are, first, for a well-educated lay audience, as I know many of the people here in the audience are not professional historians, but who are either interested in the Second World War, interested in the dynamics of war in general, in your own policy lives or in your reading. So I want to talk first about that level, and then I'll talk about our field of Soviet history and Nazi studies more specifically. So one thing is that it is a phenomenally beautifully written book, and that doesn't always happen in the world of talking about the Second World War. But Michael, in this book, Crucibles of Power, has taken numerous life stories. You just heard about a couple of them, numerous life stories tracing individuals, peasants, lawyers, future partisans, people at different parts of the social spectrum with different life stories, backgrounds, families, some with compromised backgrounds from having been affiliated with former people once the revolution happened, and shows how those life stories develop, how they get inflected, how at certain key moments these people make choices. That's the kind of biographical logics that plays out throughout the book, but it also makes just for a really beautiful read, because we really do follow the life stories of people living in truly extraordinary and harrowing times. We really get also an unparalleled understanding of the workings of these two regimes when they meet in this one very specific place. There aren't many historians who are capable of reading in both Russian and in German, and who have done the work equally on both sides in all of these archives to understand the local dynamics of power, the local power relations, the way things are playing out, rather than just looking up sort of only from Moscow and Berlin and sort of projecting down, through plans. And so to see the actual chaos and the ways that power levels of power work in this one locale is really illuminating. But this is not only a regional history. As Michael noted, Hitler and Stalin are present. It has all Union national implications. And so I would hate to call Smolensk a case study, because that makes it sound like a sort of just little particular case, but it really is one of the best ways I think we have to understand the workings of early Stalinism, high Stalinism, and the way it changes over the course of the Second World War. So often books in the past would take one segment, or maybe just stop when the war came because it was just too much to deal with, or only did the wartime, but to really trace that arc with the same characters and combining all of these sources from different sides, I think really gives us a sense about how the Soviet Union worked and didn't work. And we get many useful, for a history book, many useful frameworks for understanding. So one is this biographical logics, sort of an understanding of how people's life stories compound as new circumstances come up. We also get, as Michael mentioned, these levels of power, understanding that power is not just top down, that sort of in an authoritarian regime like Stalinism was, that there was sort of dictates from high and then they sort of went onto the ground and then were or weren't carried out, but a sort of cycle in which the top, in sort of the center, is initiating revolutionary change through chaos, through provoking grassroots uprisings that sort of purge a middle layer of the system, but then help create upward social mobility. This is a really interesting multi-directional dynamic that really helps us visualize the workings of power and change, and sometimes through violence and sometimes through structures and governance. So I think that's very important. But all the while, these sorts of structures and ways of understanding get nuance, get complication through the human beings who are living and making these choices. And they are not just sort of functions of a certain model, but real lives. And it's through these real lives that we can come to a sort of understanding that fully keeps the particular, if that makes sense, that fully preserves the human while helping us understand the bigger picture. So going further to what makes this book especially important for historians is that Michael mentioned Merle Feinsod, who was a sort of famous Sovietologist and wrote one of the most famous books about the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Every graduate student until recently read it. There were two different books. One was How Russia Was Ruled, but the most famous was Smolensk under Soviet rule. And it was written, was it 1958? Is that right? I got the date from you. Good. It was written in 1958. And it was based on captured archives that the Germans had captured and ended up in US hands and Allied hands after the war. But it was a mere 2% of the whole Smolensk Archive. But it was the first time during the Cold War that Western scholars could use actual archival documents. And it was one of the rare times until the opening of the archives. And so it was really just a foundational text for power, for understanding the Soviet Union, and a whole generations of scholarship were built off of it. And so obviously this book, Crucibles of Power, doesn't just build on it, but surpasses it, but in a really important way. And so I think that it would be really interesting to read these two books together to see how different generations of historians have brought their own preoccupations and their ways of understanding history, and also to look at the ways that different sources change the way we as historians tell the story. I think that these levels of power that I've already described, that Michael's described in detail, are really going to change the way that we talk about power in the Soviet Union, especially because the book connects the Smolensk affair, which was one of the first sort of blow-ups of the Stalin period, sort of exiting the new economic policy and the relatively stable post-revolutionary, post-Civil War years, going into this rapid transformation, showing how Smolensk was critical to that change, showing how the same dynamics in some ways were in play when the peasants were forcibly collectivized in what we now know was a sort of brutal and sort of quasi-genocide, depending on the way that we describe it. And then that we can trace those same dynamics now also to the Great Terror by looking at these three incidences through the lens of Smolensk. I think that's really useful. I'm sure scholars are going to challenge that linear sort of using those same, sort of the same understanding for all three. But I think drawing them into one kind of mechanism is both really powerful and really compelling, but it is going to invite, of course, other scholarship that's going to add nuance or challenges, I think, in really important ways. I think the biographical logics is going to become a term that historians are going to use, at least in the field of Soviet history. And I certainly will use it and use it with my students as soon as next week. And then finally, as Michael ended with, thinking about the tragedy of Soviet POWs, thinking about the tragedy of Soviet civilians in Nazi occupation, more tightly interwoven with Holocaust and genocide studies. This, Michael's not the only person doing this, but has really given us some interesting and thorough and nuanced ways of understanding the entanglement and the dynamics, the sort of interwoven dynamics of how violence against Soviet POWs went hand in hand with the development and radicalization of the Holocaust against the Jews. So some questions I had was, here's one, is Merle Fainsod's book was shaped by the archives that he had, and it was also shaped by the time in which he was writing and the ways that people understood government, understood power. So how would you say that sources shape your story? And how would you say that your own training and time shape your story? So I guess one way of thinking of it is the sort of chicken and egg. Did the idea of biographical logics send you to find life stories, or did the proliferation of life stories lead you to come up with that idea?
Well, first of all, thank you for those comments. And there's a lot to discuss, but I'll pick up on your question about Fainsod, who understood power as administration, essentially. And that came, because he had served in World War II in the US. And so, he understood then total control being the culmination of what evolution of Soviet power, except that full total control only came after 1937, after the Smolensk Archive ended, and he found all this chaos and lack of total control before the so it was a little bit of a paradox, but it was not just his time. Yes, of course, we understand that power is now not just force or control, but there's all sorts of dimensions to it, including the power of ideology and the power of propaganda to create an alternative universe. But power on the local level and in power relations. So in a way, the whole revolutions in the human sciences that started, with Foucault after the 70s and 80s really allowed me to find some of the ways that Fainsod actually misunderstood parts of the Smolensk affair, because he took all these accusations on a little bit on face value without understanding that they were, part of the power play. But you ask a really interesting question, is that we can't really stand fully outside of our own time and say, look back. But since the 2010s, the whole decade, pretty much when I was researching this book, are now part of history. What we can say is that, first of all, the era of open archives that I was going to, I got new materials down until 2019, which changed the nature of this book. The Osoboye Papki, the secret, were, from Smolensk, top-level correspondence between the party leaders in Smolensk and the NKVD and Moscow. Some of those folders became available to me only in 2019, when the crackdown leading up to the current war was occurring. But what really changed my book, to answer your question, was the discovery of those autobiographical documents. And this is where I will just briefly speak for a minute, because I went into this looking at grand historical forces. It was paradoxically Putin's cult of World War II, which led to this outpouring of so-called ego documents. And also in 2015, the Minsk Commission interviews that were historians conducted with 70 people from Smolensk region. I read every single one of those because they were so illuminating. And, so I had the idea not to use lives as a kind of illustration like many books do, as kind of a decoration, but what I've been working, since the late 80s in Soviet archives, my whole life. And the bureaucratic sources that you see in the created by the state only get you so far, even if you read between the lines. So what I found, and this was kind of liberating for me as I wrote this book, was that looking deeply into individuals, into biography and autobiography, actually in conjunction, not separately, not as texts or discourse alone, but looking deeper into the lives after I had spent years contextualizing them, that actually got me deeper into some questions than I could have without those lives. So that's what I would say was, for me, changed the most.
That's great. I want to know, I would like to ask how much more time I have before we switch to Stephen Kotkin, because I can sort of tailor my questions around that.
Why don't you go for another question, and then we'll give a call on Stephen, and maybe later on you'll have another chance. There may be some time in the Q&A to ask some more questions.
I'm going to go straight for that question then. That's great. Which is, as I was reading, I was thinking about two major books that many people here might have read, and that certainly every scholar in our field has read, and how your work might change those stories. And one is you've already referenced, which is Tim Snyder's Bloodlands. Does this change our story and our understanding, and how so? And the other is, of course, the other book we today look to understand Stalinism, which is Magnetic Mountain by Stephen Kotkin.
I thought you said there was going to be softball questions, Nicole, but okay. Snyder's book created a lot of reactions. I participated in discussion a bit. I think it was 2009 that came out, right? In my view, this was the culmination of an entire trajectory of books that were essentially in a comparative mode, comparing systems, which, was a classic intellectual problem of the 20th century, and one which I was deeply immersed in, comparing Stalinism to Nazism. But Tim Snyder did something more. By looking at what he called the bloodlands, the lands in between, he was also looking how the two regimes acted upon one another and interacted, especially in the case of Poland, which was central for him. But he knew a lot of languages, and he synthesized a great deal of national scholarship and put it together. And he didn't ever use the word entanglements, but he was in a way doing it before avant la lettre, without the term itself in some ways. So it was a transition to the kind of work that Jan Gross, also extremely influential book, especially in terms of how locals appropriated power for themselves in his book Revolution from Abroad, but also the book Neighbors, which looked at non-German collaborators and perpetrators and opened up a huge amount of scholarship. So I'd say Gross belongs in that pantheon of giants whose shoulders I stood upon. However, I think Snyder used lives to create pathos and tragedy, not to deeply explore the regional and local levels. And so that's what I was trying to flip the script in a way. And in terms of, Magnetic Mountain, I remember sitting in the Harriman Institute in the 1990s, shortly before that, with Stephen Kotkin, before that book appeared. That book, of all the books, that deal with power, pretty much every book on political, social, and other kinds of history has to grapple with what power is in the Soviet Union. And we talk all the time about Soviet power, but there are remarkably few books that actually made power into its central topic. And that was one of the first, and I would say Steve Kotkin's later books, The Paradoxes of Power was the subtitle of the volume 1. So I assign Feinsod, I assign the Stalin biography, I assign all these things in my graduate classes. But I would say that we're looking at Stalin at the center in that, in the biography, and we're looking at a city, Magnitogorsk, in the first book. And so in a way, I was kind of one of the things I took from Magnetic Mountain was the different centers of power, right? The party, the factory committee, and the and Moscow. And one of the things I took from the first biography, The Paradoxes of Power, was how this was a regime that had colossal strengths, right? Mass mobilization, incredible centralization, a very experienced secret police, but also had colossal weaknesses and made colossal blunders. And you see that on the local and regional level. I was just, in a way, also flipping the script. As for Stalinism itself, the first biography goes, and here Khlevniuk's biography of Stalin goes from the Tsaritsyn methods of the Civil War as a methodology of Stalinism to the Great Terror, and I was trying to place the late 20s as an intermediary step in between. So one could go on, but we have a limited time.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you especially, Nicole, for such thoughtful comments and questions. It now gives me great privilege to turn to one of the true giants in our field, Professor Stephen Kotkin. He's the Kleinheinz Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, a Senior Fellow at Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and the Berkelen Professor in History and International Affairs Emeritus at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. We already just heard about some of his research and publications. His research encompasses geopolitics and authoritarian regimes in history and in the present. His publications include Stalin, Waiting for Hitler, 1929 to 1941, and Stalin, Paradoxes of Power. Michael just referenced it, 1878 to 1928, 2 parts of a planned 3-volume history of Russian power in the world and of Stalin's power in Russia. And we're all eagerly waiting for number 3. In fact, he told us he was working on this just up to our very session here. So for our audience, appreciate that he's taking time out from this important 3rd volume to be with us. He has also written a history of Stalin's system's rise from a street-level perspective. Michael also mentioned it, Magnetic Mountain, Stalinism as a Civilization, and a trilogy analyzing communism's demise, of which 2 volumes have appeared thus far: Armageddon Averted, The Soviet Collapse 1970 to 2000, and Uncivil Society 1989 and the Implosion of the Communist Establishment. The 3rd volume will be on the Soviet Union and the Third World and Afghanistan. Dr. Kotkin was a scholar, fellow with the Wilson Center in 1988. It's been a while. We hope we get you back sometime, Stephen. And with that, welcome back to the Wilson Center and the Washington History Seminar. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for the honor of the invitation. And congratulations to Michael on the book. It's a major book on a tremendously important subject. Lots of innovation, lots of revelations in the book. You would think that we would know World War II backwards and forwards at this point, with all of the books, many of them right behind me on the shelf, let alone the one that I'm trying to finish up. But we don't know it as well as we think, and Michael has demonstrated that yet again. Let me have 2 pathways into the book, if that's okay. The first is on the word choices. This is a potentially fraught term in a regime like this, in a time period like this. My choices are different from the choices that people make under the threat of death at any moment because of what they say, or even just what they think, or what they refuse to say or refuse to think. These are not free and open choices by any means, as Michael understands really well. So when we use the word choices, do we invite potentially misleading comparisons? Do we fail to acknowledge upfront and in demonstrative fashion the constraints on people who are operating here? After all, one of the arguments in the literature about collaboration is that the French collaborated because they could, and the Poles resisted because they didn't really have the operation, the possibility, the option of collaboration, because of the way the Nazi regime treated the two different populations. Now, that's a broad generalization, and obviously there are many nuances and qualifications necessary. It just illustrates use of the term choice. So I'm going to invite Michael to elaborate what he means by choice and how choices were constrained or not constrained, the continuum or gradation that he sees of various choices that people made or failed to make or couldn't make. That'll be the first line of inquiry for him to address. The second is on the term totalitarianism. Totalitarianism does not appear in the index of his book, which would be unusual for most books that dealt with both the Nazi and the Soviet regime in what is, after all, a murderous war. I mean, murder more than war, in fact, is what we're describing here. I'd like to point out that totalitarianism is biography. One of the most important demonstrations or revelations by Jan Gross's work, which Michael referenced, and I would put my own work in the category, although not on the level of Jan's, is to show just how much individual biography reveals and really enacts a totalitarian regime. And so it's in some ways more than appropriate that a book about totalitarianism, in my view, would use a biographical approach. And yet, to me, it's semi-paradoxical that that analytical framework is not favored. The biography is there. The elements of totalitarianism are on every page, and yet it's not in the index. Let me also point out that totalitarianism, as we defined it, Jan Gross and I, is to use one's own agency to annihilate one's agency. In other words, you accept the call to denounce your neighbors, you accept the call for some level of mobilization and violence, and in the act of doing that, you preclude your own agency as a fully fledged agent going forward, because the destruction that you participate in reduces your capacity to be a fully fledged agent. So in some ways, totalitarianism is agency to destroy agency. And this circles me back then to my first line of inquiry on the choices that we're talking about. I'm not someone who believes there's a complete absence of free will, but I am someone who understands what it was like to live in these societies, brought home on every page, as I said, with this book. And so if Michael could take a moment here to talk both about choices and about totalitarianism and agency, I would be grateful.
Thank you for that. I'll take a stab. And the choices, as you know, there's a term choiceless choice that's prevalent in Holocaust studies, because no matter what choice you made, you ended up dead. And that was introduced a long time ago into Holocaust studies. But the people that I was studying, and of course I include the ghettos and I include the Jewish population, but many of the people who were not Jewish or not in camps or confined, or in military units, actually, where choice was extremely constrained, like the anti-partisan unit, because no one wanted you to leave the unit and learn about the crimes they were committing. So there was almost like real constraints on there was a kind of path dependency, right? And I write a lot about this. Once certain choices are made, they lead to other ones. But so I do think that choice, many of the people I wrote about, however, had more room for maneuver. And what you have to, I think about is that state capacity was radically less than we might assume from the term totalitarianism on the local level. And this is on the level of the village, on the level of the district, and on the level of the county, and even on the level of the district. The party regional committees berated the district level because they were virtually the only levers of power. There's an anecdote I bring in from 1937 in Bielski Rayon, which is one of the better documented districts in the Smolensk Archive, when the local party boss, who was incredibly brutal, they lived in the towns. He was afraid to go outside the town because he would have been lynched. So I mean, I think on the very, very local level, you don't find the kind of total control. This is already mixing up the two questions, but there are many definitions of totalitarianism, but in the Arendtian sense of total control, which was a very abstract and early take because she knew the German case much better than the Soviet case. You don't see that kind of total control. Or Menshagin fooled the Germans by, he would put out a fake notice on the front of a building because the Germans were so obedient to written orders where every Soviet would just ignore them. But he managed to fool the Wehrmacht soldiers in the city in some buildings by putting out like a fake notice. So he had agency. And I think so choice, I think, in my view, it's not some grand philosophical comparison with, let's say, free market systems or liberal systems or systems that have much, much greater, in fact, make choice into part of the ideology, right? You go into a supermarket and part of the point is that you have a smorgasbord of choices. So I'm not trying to make a grand comparison. What I'm essentially trying to do is look at a synonym for agency. And I also talk about tragic choice, people's whose choices or decision making is another synonym. They led to just basically, they had no good choices and they led to tragedy. And, there are many examples of this in the book. And as far as totalitarianism, I touched on this a little bit, but I think one of the reasons I avoided it in the text, not in the actual, I think in the cover description, it says, it refers to dueling forms of murderous totalitarianism. As the author, I didn't cross that out because I have no real objection to the term totalitarianism insofar as it signals that these regimes and certain others were not run-of-the-mill authoritarianisms. They were special and they were different. And John Connolly once wrote an article called Totalitarianism, Useful Concept, Defunct Term, because it had so many different the waters were muddied by historical school that posited a teleology from Lenin to Stalin and certain forms of total control, by the political science definition with their checklists of features, by the Arendtian philosophical understanding of eliminating sort of sovereignty. So I didn't want to just in a book for a broad audience get into the weeds of this term, but I do not necessarily reject it.
Thank you. Stephen, do you have further questions or a rejoinder or?
Yeah, I just say that if you ask the people in Poland, Feensad didn't invent totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt didn't invent it. Brzezinski and others didn't invent this. the people of Poland experienced it firsthand. First, when the Nazi regime came in, and then when the Soviet regime came in, and they made the comparisons themselves in their own understandings, writings, and oral history about what they experienced, how the regimes overlapped. And I'm going to guess that the inhabitants of Smolensk also had a good basis of comparison of the two regimes. They didn't need anybody's schema. They didn't need any rubbish about total control, the absence of total control. They didn't need any political science or political theory. They were just there on the receiving end. And so if you want to get back to the people who are the center of your story, and you want to get back to the biography and the experiential level, and you want to take seriously what Jan Gross, his revision of the totalitarian idea, which dates to 1983 in Soviet studies, an article 5 years before Revolution from Abroad came out, or 5 years before my dissertation was filed. I think it's available for understanding at a visceral level. But anyway, that's just a comment, not necessarily a question. I think this opens up, however, another question, which is what happens as a result of the actions that people take. In other words, you're talking about choices or decisions. They're not choiceless choices, Holocaust style. As I said, there's a spectrum here on the choice question. More constrained, less constrained, different kind of constraints. But you alluded to this earlier, that something happens when people make certain choices or fail to make other choices. They end up in situations that maybe they didn't want to be in, that they didn't expect to be in, or the opposite. That opportunity opens up in front of them. Right? One of the most amazing things about totalitarianism is it allows individuals to privatize state power, to use Jan Gross's terminology. And so they're able to enact state capacity as private individuals on their neighbors, on their communities, on their perceived enemies. So in your mind, let's accept your view of the choices for purposes of discussion. What happens once the choices are made? Where are we then in the understanding, the landscape in which they're enmeshed?
Well, first of all, on totalitarianism, those are all very interesting thoughts, and it's hard to encapsulate in a short response. But the totalitarianism term was connected to a kind of global comparison between the two regimes and systems that I was trying to get away from. And that's also connected to why I was trying to get a different framework. Because if you're comparing National Socialism to Stalinism, you can't compare it on the basis of Smolensk. What you have in Smolensk is the German army occupation. It's a very wartime particular instantiation of Nazism. And you're also looking at it in a particular slice of time, right? And many people have written in this, the book Beyond Totalitarianism. It matters what period you compare the two, right? It's the 40s, it's the 30s. So what I tried to do here was to try to look at these two as revolutionary regimes. And I think this is not a convention in the German field. George Mosse used the term evocatively, but not in a serious way of looking at. And actually, when I was sitting next to Jack Goldstone at the Wilson Center, leading authority on comparative revolution, that's where I got some of these ideas, because he also thought there are such things as right-wing revolutions, radical revolutionary regimes of the far right, as we well know in the world we're living in as well. But revolutions, if you take that seriously, right, it's not about storming the Bastille or the Winter Palace. These come in stages and life cycles, and that was a framework for understanding. So when these two regimes met in 1941, they were at different stages of their life cycle. Stalinism was already making a kind of weird hybrid turn towards very hierarchical, statist partially revolutionary regime, whereas the invasion of the Soviet Union and the introduction of the revival of the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism was a moment of the greatest radicalization of the Nazi right-wing revolution, which was directed at conquest and domination. So that's just another way of answering another dimension to the question of totalitarianism. As for choice and what your second question about, yes, opportunity is a big thing here. And there are many people who paradoxically see in these tragedies and cataclysms a moment to seize to rectify something in their lives, to advance themselves, where they've been stymied before the cataclysm breaks. And I also cited and used Gross's term, the privatization of power, except I don't think privatization is such a great word for a communist system, perhaps, but the concept is clear. What happens as a result of this is that these regimes function. They are enabled, and they cannot function without the acquiescence, but also the active participation of these actors who see some reason to go along with it. However, I would say, though, that despite the fact that they were able to compare the two regimes, in terms of there were all sorts of ways where locals found differences among the two. The peasants, the Germans were not nearly as efficient as extracting grain, so they were sometimes not as dissatisfied by the wartime regime. However, the Germans were far more murderous. The waves of violence were unprecedented, and they did not even feel like, and this is something Berkhoff writes about, that they did not even feel that propaganda and education were needed for these subhumans. And so paradoxically, they came to see that some locals came to see, fair amount of them actually, that the Soviet regime was perhaps, they thought the Germans were going to be better, but it was even worse. But you start to see differences as well as similarities. And the thing is that you see the similarities on the level of common denominators that you can boil down to, but the similarities are often the differences are often particular. I'll end there.
Thank you. Stephen, you're good? All right, excellent. Let me remind our audience that you're welcome to join us. Our preferred way for you to join the conversation is to use the raise hand function, and you can directly intervene in the conversation. Otherwise, please use the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality, and I'll put the question to our speakers. Michael, I'd like to call on Nicole for a further question, but maybe one question first. Since we're here at the Washington History Seminar at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where we don't do history and research just for history's sake, but with a view to the public affairs world, why should our audience be interested in reading this book today? What can it tell us about Russia today, the contemporary political landscape?
When I started writing this book, I never thought that it would be so relevant. It was a tragic episode. These were the far-off bloodlands, right, that were incredibly instructive, but one step removed. And I think what we're seeing now, first in case of Russia, what we saw in the late 2010s and especially after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, was the resurrection of certain models, both from the late Soviet Brezhnev period, where some of these generation had its roots, but incredibly also to the World War II era, when this war is being fought by drones and online, but also on the ground in fashion that is not so incredibly different from certain features of World War II. That's one thing. And, history rhymes, is often said. It doesn't repeat itself, and there's no direct line. Some people are saying it rhymes too much today, but there's a way in which I tried to connect my story to both the 2010s that I lived through and the crackdown at the end and the war in Ukraine. One was through the afterlives of my main characters. And for example, one of the partisans who wrote a revealing autobiography when he was in his early 20s in World War II, became a party historian, and he actually falsified the history that he had lived through and helped create the war myth and allowed me to create this incredible, grandiose Soviet myth of World War II. And when you talk about the victory, the superiority of socialism, the leading role of the party, the war myth that was resurrected in the 2010s is very different, but it's not so hard to discern the relationship with, civilization and grand geopolitical forces that obscure the horrors and the costs of war and the way that World War II was taught in the late Soviet period and in the post-Soviet period. And what we were trying to do in Moscow in the 2010s when I was at the Higher School of Economics was introduce that human dimension, which was not present in the textbooks, either Soviet or post-Soviet. So that's one dimension to the answer. There are many others, but I think that another thing we see, and this is not just particular to the Russian regime now, but to kind of what we're seeing in the world today is that there is a dynamic, and Stephen Kotkin has written about this as well, in which catastrophes are deliberately created from above. They lead to unexpected consequences and colossal failures, and yet the people who carry them out double down and triple down and blame the problems on enemies. And so, even though the regimes in today's world are harder to, are not as mass murderous. They're not committing mass violence on nearly the same scale. There is an authoritarian playbook, and I think that can be illuminated from studying the past.
Thank you very much. Let me turn it over to Nicole to circle back to her list of questions. Nicole, over to you.
Great. I was trying to write out this question in a logical way, and I didn't quite finish it. So allow me to sort of circumnavigate the question until I get there. I had the experience when my own book about the sort of reverse, a German city that became Soviet, when it came out, there was a random internet chatter, people who read the book out in the world, and I was very pleased that people out in the world were reading the book, but debate about who was worse, and the accusation that I had sided with the Nazis and had said the Soviets were worse. This was not at all my intention of the book, and not at all a reading of the book that I thought one could get out of it. But what I realized was, in the world of the readership, there was a fixation on sort of comparative bad guys, and sort of comparing, sort of lesser and greater evils. Do you do that on the scale of bodies? Do you do that on the scale of transformations, evil intentions? But that kind of calculation, who was worse, was still important. And so that's a question that got me thinking. If you could take a stab at that very unfair question, what your book might tell us, whether the good guys and the bad guys. That's part one. Part two is related to that, which is a follow-up on Steve's choices comment. Throughout the book, there are characters, none of whom are heroes. Some, maybe a couple are heroes, all of whom are making choices with various degrees of agency, availability to maneuver, depending on the context, depending on their social background, etc. Do you feel that our fields of German history during the Second World War, of Soviet history in general and during the Second World War, still compel us to signal to the reader who is good and who is bad? I am asking this because I feel that often the field seemed preoccupied with a kind of making a virtue statement. And I don't mean a virtue statement in a kind of politicized way today, but into sort of denouncing what is bad, and sort of coming in with a moral perspective. So there's two layers to that question. One is sort of, are there good guys and bad guys? How would you reframe that to disagree? And also with your own main characters, would you say that how did you go about writing them? As complex human beings, did you try to break free of good and evil? Did you take it into account?
Those are great questions. And, I wasn't being a hanging judge, like Croce said, historian should not be. So I tried to develop some degree of empathy, at least for my subjects, although for many of them, they were, some of them are very hard to be empathetic towards, but at least towards understanding, right? Completely understanding is not to forgive, right? But it's to understand. But the lesser evil debate was dominant for this comparative history that I was talking about that dominated the late 20th century. And I think one thing, I mentioned before that some locals may have, decided that one was worse than the other, and the partisans certainly, and there, the number of people who actively took sides in the countryside was about 20% approximately, according to one party report on each side. And the vast people in the middle were, switching back and forth. There was a lot of side switching. But, aside from what local perceptions were, which were obviously based on lots of very imperfect information and also imperfect concepts, because we didn't have the concept of genocide or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity. But aside from all of that, I was trying to get away from these global comparisons and look at interactions. And I have some pretty startling material on, for example, a report sent to Stalin on admiring German psychological propaganda, saying that we should use more psychological methods, we should use less didactic, heavy-handed methods, and more humor in our propaganda. And this is they were learning from one another, because this was not in the pre-war period. There was only a few elites and travelers who could make these kinds of comparisons, and then suddenly millions of people could make them in the midst of World War II. But I do think that in terms of the German and Soviet fields, virtue signaling you mentioned, there's also on the opposite side of the coin, which is that people like to talk about gray areas and not use the term collaboration. And I felt that the moment that we live in, calling attention to the people who actually made these regimes work. They were the sine qua non for having them function on the local and regional levels, should, despite all complications, be labeled collaborators. I want to leave some room for questions from the audience if we have, so I could go on, of course, but thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, we have a somewhat quiet, unusually quiet audience this afternoon. There is a question about if you could briefly, Michael, since you mentioned him, explain your the impact of Foucault on your thinking and your history writing. And I see we're getting another question now. So just if you could briefly mention Foucault's impact, and we'll go to Nellie Orr, who has dared to raise her hand. So we'll go to you in just a minute.
Well, I didn't dedicate my book to Foucault, put it that way, but I I went through the same cultural turn that everyone went through in the 80s and 90s. I read him avidly, and I would say, like many other people who are classic thinkers, Benedict Anderson or Said or whoever you want to pick, it's not just the original works, but the mountains of literature that come from that. And so, what I took was especially the power, the different dimensions of power, but also the power of expertise and the power of knowledge, because experts, even if only in terms of local intelligentsia figures, like we're talking about agronomists or foresters, these were crucial to the running of local economies and under both regimes. And in fact, they had a special position under both regimes, or school teachers, who had a different position, but were also coming to the board. So I mean, and that, you know, so I was especially attuned to the dimension of the different dimensions of power, to put it simply.
Thank you. Let me call on Nellie Orr. Nellie Orr, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question. There you go.
Yes, thank you. I would just love to hear more about the circumstances under which those interviews were taken in the 2010s, and that idea of trying to create the human, or to portray the human side of war, as well as the context of Minshagin's publication. I just quickly reminded myself by Google of when it was published in 1988 in Paris, after he had been in a Soviet prison. And so could you talk about the
Yes.
what those people, those contexts? Thank you.
All right. So thank you. And by the way, I read your dissertation, cited it in the book with really good material from the 30s that is still extremely relevant today, and was on the basis of the Smolensk Archive, that 2%, but still there's a lot in there that you were able to discover. So thank you for coming. Just a couple of the Minsk Commission was, these were the Academy of Science historians who interviewed people starting in 41, 42, and Jochen Helbeck was one of the first to start working in those collections. They opened up only in 2015, 2016. The Academy of History Institute of the Academy of Sciences had kept them closed, ironically, to all historians, and even after 91, for reasons I won't get into, but they finally opened up. And that was wartime interviews done often with, you know, in the case of Stalingrad, the party, the snipers, the heroes of the Soviet Union, the generals, you know, people, there was a kind of real selection of heroes. But then when they went to the occupied territories, there weren't that many notables they looked at, the, you know, that they could interview. Many of the people were women who stayed under occupation, like school teachers. Others were partisans, and they were speaking in a very Soviet way, but they were also, you know, they were also talking right, like within months of having escaped from encirclement, or the, you know, after being defeated by the Germans. And the party line on the war had not yet been consolidated. So these incredibly frank interviews. And so that was what I was referring to. Menshagin's memoirs, the pre-war version, was published in Paris, but the wartime memoirs were never published. And that was what primarily we published in 2019. So Menshagin was evacuated east. He ended up in Berlin, actually, but he was mayor of Bobruisk after Smolensk, and he kept moving west with the Germans because his, you know, but when his family, he thought they had been captured by the Soviets. They had actually entered the American zone, and he went back and tried to meet them and was captured by the Soviets. He was interrogated in the Lubyanka for almost, you know, 8 years before being sentenced to 25 years, much of which was in solitary confinement. But he had a phenomenal memory. He recorded his memoirs in notebooks. They were seized by the KGB, and no one was able to retrieve them after. But after he was released, he had met certain dissidents in the 60s and early 70s, and they were very interested in his activities in the procuracy under Stalinism. And so he was able in a dacha to record them almost by memory, with, you know, and we've verified names and dates. Sometimes he messes up, but they're incredibly accurate, but he leaves out everything having to do with his own culpability, because he was trying to get he was trying to petition for many years after the war for a reduced sentence in the 50s and 60s. So ultimately, you need to read those memoirs that he recreated, you know, and then were smuggled out on cassette to Germany, and then were published primarily by Pavel Polyan in 2019. You have to read them critically as well, but they are, because his strategy was to sort of exculpate himself by providing verifiable detail on a whole range of other things. When I had read the archives for years, and then I was able to read these memoirs, I was able to put a lot together about the way the local wartime governance functioned in Smolensk between 41 and 43.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. That also answered one of the other questions in the Q&A. Let me put a question to you. Perhaps it's the final one by Dallas Mickelbacher. He's interested in the Soviet POWs. His questions are, you mentioned in your closing comments that you viewed the starvation of POWs as a means of coercing collaboration among the prisoners. Can you elaborate a bit on the nature of the evidence you have for that? And can you say a bit about how your findings regarding the Smolensk region tie into the larger historiographic debate as to whether mass starvation of POWs was the result of the pre-existing hunger plan or the result of the crisis the Germans faced on the Eastern Front in the fall of 1941?
Mm-hmm. Those are big questions, but I'll try to be brief.
Yeah.
So in terms of recruiting collaborators, so there were, when the POWs, right, there was a kind of filtration going on when they were first brought into camps, especially during the great encirclements of 41, early 42. There were mass numbers of, the colossal numbers of POWs, because Stalin never ordered retreats. There were these huge encirclements, as you know. And many people were selected. We have the documents, people with skills, craftsmen, people, people with technical skills were simply let out of the camps. Other categories of, while Jewish people, these are among the first victims of the Holocaust, were immediately shot, and this was part of the Commissar order. So immediately you have those two processes going on. But the occupation regimes, right, as you get in from the winter of 41 to 42, it's clear that they're not going to have a quick victory. They're going to have a long-term occupation. And that's where the rules start to change in a very complicated process that mostly German historians have elaborated. I found a few extra details, but that the process of letting especially ethnic Russians collaborate, that was a shift in 42. And I found some smoking guns where because I was able to get into some of the really kind of local Wehrmacht documentation. It was very hard to find in Freiburg in the military archive. But, when they said, starving people, if we give them half decent rations, they're going to work for us. I mean, it's right there in the documents. So I was able to establish at one of the, and many of the propagandists, people from the Vlasov, later joined the Vlasov movement, people who became part of the German language press were recruited. Some very fascinating and sinister characters also were recruited from these POW camps. As for the hunger plan, it wasn't so much a blueprint because, as classic works like Christian Gerlach have shown, they simply weren't able to starve so many people. The people melted away in the countryside, and the locals knew the local territories much better. But the hunger plan set the tone, in my view, for mass starvation, especially in the winter of 41 and 42. This was something I was talking about, the murderous logic of these regimes. When most genocides or atrocities are committed in the midst of war, the plans for actually starving tens of millions were made by the Nazis in advance of the war, and they couldn't even carry out their own murderous plans on the scale they intended. So I think that's a very, almost very singular in historical terms. But I think it was less a blueprint than but the orders to live off the land and not provide any resources certainly made for mass starvation. But it was also the death marches and the shootings that contributed, wasn't only, and disease. And people at the time lacked the term genocide. They lacked the term crimes against humanity. But Soviet physicians in those death camps talked simply about the destruction of human lives and human beings. And they talked very eloquently, and they understood in that sense, to get back to one of Stephen Kotkin's comments, they understood what was going on.
Thank you. I'm afraid we'll have to bring this really rich discussion to an end. My Thanks to Michael, Nicole, and Stephen for a really, really wonderful panel. Of course, Eric as well. And Eric will have the final word this afternoon. Thank you, Eric.
My thanks as well to everyone for this stimulating discussion. And let me remind folks that our next session of the Washington History Seminar will take place on Monday, March 10th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we reconvene to discuss Samuel Hirsch's Against the Liberal Order, the Soviet Union, Turkey, and Statist Internationalism, 1919 to 1939. Till then, take care. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.